Hello Internet, welcome back to Tromsø Twilight. This is the channel where I, Vincent, talk to you, the digital abyss, about books, movies, music that I find interesting, that I enjoy, or a combination of the two. And today I'm going to be talking about a book written by somebody who is primarily known as a musician. That is Emma Ruth Rundle's book of poetry, The Bella Vista, uh, published relatively recently, copyright last year. I got a feeling it might have actually come out physically this year, not 100% sure. I'm going to talk a little bit about Emma Ruth Rundle in general first, and then I'm going to talk about the book. So Emma Ruth Rundle, she's a photographer, she does drawings, she writes poetry, but she's best known as a musician. She was in the bands Nocturnes and Marriages, but the first I heard of her was her solo album, Electric Guitar One, which I found on Bandcamp back in the day. It came out in 2011. I think I might have found it a little later. Another major album from her is Marked for Death that came out in 2016. She recorded this out in the desert at a time when she had quite serious alcohol issues. The whole album is like this kind of heavy but influenced by shoegaze, singer-songwriter type of album. It's very beautiful but very intense, very dark. I love this record. I loved it when it came out, and then the next album that really made an impact on me from her was her collaboration album that she did with the band Thou in 2020 called May Our Chambers Be Full. This was a kind of like sludgy, doomy album with her vocals kind of contrasting to a certain extent with this soundscape. This was pretty much my lockdown album. I was never in lockdown because I was working in a psychiatric crisis team at the time, but the world was in lockdown when I was listening to this album, and it was also Arctic winter. So the soundtrack was perfect. And then again, another album that meant a great deal to me was shortly after she released a solo album called Engine of Hell, where she did songs where she either played acoustic guitar or piano, and I believe that the performances are like one take performances where she plays and sings at the same time. Very subdued, very low key. You might hear influences from Tori Amos in the piano work. The songs are just gorgeous, and it's the first album she made sober. I saw her on the tour of that album in early 2022 in a church in Oslo. If you ever get the chance to see her play live, it's just incredible. It's like she stretched out the compositions, and the dynamic range that she was playing with was just insane. She was obviously quite uncomfortable on the stage, but at the same time, kind of no mistakes, just perfect performance. So she kind of combines this like raw and slightly uncomfortable persona or style on stage with just fantastic musical performance and brilliant songs. I'm also a person who has a photograph from that was made by Emma Ruth Rundle hanging in my consultation room at the psychiatric hospital where I work. So patients that come to speak to me about problems they're having in their life have the opportunity to see one of her artworks on the wall in my office. That's how much she means to me as an artist and a musician. Which means, I was interested to read her poetry book, and I've kind of sometimes been disappointed by poetry written by people who I think are good lyricists. A good example is I don't think PJ Harvey's writing really translates very well over to the written page. I think she's much better as a songwriter. But I'm happy to say that this book has a lot going for it. It's definitely worth reading if you like poetry. You don't need to be an Emma Ruth Rundle fan to enjoy this book, though a lot of it is kind of written in the context of being on tour. So knowing that she's a musician and that she's traveling around can definitely increase your understanding of the tone and the vibe of a lot of these poems. According to the blurb on the book, these poems are presented chronologically, and they're written in the context of a relationship, a love relationship. They're written across a year or so with a kind of burgeoning romantic relationship where a lot of the time this relationship is being conducted over distance. There are many poems about relationships in the book, but I didn't feel that the you in the book was always the same person, though clearly a lot of these poems are love poems or versions of love poems directed to this person. It's kind of a situation where the writer of the poems is often trying to understand themselves and their life in the context of the addressee, the person who the poem is written to. But I also felt that the I in the poems was a little flexible. Like when you read Emily Dickinson, all the poems are in the I form, but you get the sense that they are rarely actually written from Emily Dickinson's perspective. The I is just like a kind of feature of the style. Some of these poems struck me as a bit like that. I might be wrong. I also got the definite sense that the you shifts. The you is not always the romantic partner that she's writing to. The writing style in the poems is a lot different to her songs. I think she's a really, really great lyricist, especially on that album Engine of Hell. I think that some of the writing is just fantastic. There's one poem, there's one song, the last song on the album, that's about kind of leaving this life and being after death. There's another poem that's written to a close friend about a day they spent together, and really evocative lyrical writing. These poems are sort of less lyrical often. They're more in a sort of 20th century or more contemporary poetry style, a little fragmented at times, a little oblique at times, other times quite kind of direct, shifting between that. Rarely are they using a kind of set meter, and rarely do they employ rhyme. It's more in this kind of free verse style a lot of the time. There are lots of allusions at the same time that might remind you of modernist or even romantic poetry, in the way that when you read in Keats or Shelley, they're throwing in allusions to like classical mythology or the Bible in a way that they just expect you to know what these people are. And you might pick up some references and you won't understand others. And if you're really interested, you can Google them and find out. These poems are very elusive in that way, referencing things that I know the tarot. So at times she's referencing the tarot, but there are other things that I think are either from Catholicism or from classics that I don't know what she's alluding to always. The poems are also in dialogue with each other. They use a lot of the same references sort of across poems to give you the real sense that this is written in a series. So some of the allusions that she uses a lot are like references to the moon, and especially strawberry moon. She talks about arable land as a kind of metaphor for a relationship. There's references to postcards, I guess, sending postcards when she's on the road. As I said, many seem to be addressed to the same person. There's also a series of poems through the book that are all called Bacchi, or I don't know if it's Bacchi or Bashi, but I think it's Italian and it means window. These poems are shorter and often kind of either just statements that are kind of surreal or like more abstract. My favourite one is on page 33. In its entirety, it reads, "Art will require sacrifices. You really can't imagine when you first pick up her tools and summon the unseen." Let's talk more specifically about some things that jumped out at me in the book. One of the things is repeated references to St. Francis, which is interesting to me because I'm quite resistant to the mythology around St. Francis. People often quote this famous Francis of Assisi poem or prayer, the prayer of St. Francis, which is like, let me ask not to be loved, but to love. Let me ask not for forgiveness, but to forgive. And I hate this poem because it's this kind of, or this prayer. It's, to me, like everything that's wrong with this like masochistic version of Christianity, used kind of as an excuse to like engage in self-flagellation or self-neglect. It's really interesting how she uses it throughout the book, because she does refer to flagellation and also pilgrimage. But she writes towards the end of one poem, "I will not seek to be consoled. I will not seek to be loved." And out of the context of the prayer and as kind of like a statement, it's like there's something more subtle about that use of it. It's like, I won't seek to be loved. That's potentially quite a liberating thing to say. I'm interested as well, like because suffering is kind of a big part of what she writes about and what her music is about. So I'm interested in what Saint Francis represents for her. I don't totally understand it, but I think that it's something that really resonates with her in some way. And I guess, there's also lots of references to Italy, both in the title of the book and in the title of these repeated poems, and in this sort of going to maybe to Assisi. So something for this person from America coming to Europe and going to Italy, and like the seat of Catholicism. A poem I really liked as well was a poem called Goodbye Horses. I think this poem was enriched for me because I, as somebody who's interested in Rundle, know that she was married to another musician who is the band leader of a separate band who also became her live band for the album On Dark Horses, and that they got divorced around the time that the album Engine of Hell was recorded. So this book and this tour and this new relationship are in the kind of shadow of that divorce. This is a little bit kind of on the border of being like celebrity gossip, I guess, but knowing that, I read this poem Goodbye Horses as a poem about divorce or about the end of that relationship. And it's a really complex poem because it starts with a quote from the other person saying, "Oh, I wrote about you." And she describes being written about as a kind of violence, like the way that this person can put you in a song or put you on the page, and how they can like define you or turn you into part of their narrative, and that women have been subjected to this, forever. But then she kind of turns it around at the end of the poem, because which is something I thought of right at the start. I was like, how can you say that when you're now writing a poem about him, and you've written about people in your songs? But at the end of the poem, she brings it back and kind of takes some ownership of the fact that she does the same thing, and that writing is her power. So it's like this mutual violence of writing and being written about. Another one that I really liked is a poem called I Often Pray for the Plane to Crash. And on the opposite side, there's a photograph of out of the window of a plane. And the plane is actually a Norwegian Airlines plane. So I was like, oh, that's interesting. Maybe she took it when she was in Norway, or at least in Scandinavia. This poem is again, like quite complex and quite oblique, like many of them. But part of it seems to be an intervention in the discourse of like good and bad that is so much applied to public figures, writers, musicians, artists, where everybody wants to give these people a kind of moral status, and there's always like an argument raging about whether this person is an acceptable individual or not, and whether it's therefore like acceptable to like their work or not. And she writes something really great in the end of the poem that I take as being kind of about this. Liminal. As a child, I believed in goodness. There was a side to take. As an adult, I know it's complicated, and I don't care anymore. We've taken all the great and small minds of each generation and applied them to the why and what, only to sing, is that all there is? When it's been found out all of the time, most of it is pain. There are so many references just in this small stanza, to Peggy Lee, to Ginsberg, but also I love this idea of her just saying like, okay, it's not a good person, it's not a bad person, it's just a person in pain. Towards the end of the book, she starts to experiment more with form. There is one poem called Abandonment Size that seems to be an instruction to tear out the pages of a book and then look into the black binding, hold it just before your face, and so you'll get this sense of kind of like endless space, and that this is a way of experiencing abandonment size. And then on the following two pages, the pages are just black so that you can do this exercise without destroying your copy of the book. Then there are some circular poems at the end, one that's like written in a ring, and one that is locations of the tour kind of put into a circle that I think are references back to the moon that's being referenced throughout. And then the very last poem, it's not actually the very last, there's like a little one at the back, but the last major poem in the collection is this very tender poem addressed to the person who, the book seems to be addressed to, which was also a favourite of mine. Really beautiful. Not all the poems are good, and obviously that's normal for a collection, and I also think it's definitely makes sense when you're kind of writing this type of collection where they're all in dialogue with each other. So it's like, I think for her, maybe some of the ones that are like weaker or not very clear or don't necessarily stand alone that well, that they're kind of part of this like whole work. And so I think if you read it in its totality, then they may not stand alone as poems, but they stand very well within the context of the book as a whole. And the last thing to say is that there is also an album, which I resisted listening to before I read the book. It's called, I think, The Music from the Bella Vista, and it's mostly piano pieces that seem to be improvised or semi-improvised, recorded on a quite simple recording device. I don't know if it's like a Zoom or one of these like handheld things, or if it's just one mic. But you can hear, it's like a distance from the piano, so you can hear ambient sound. And then she's overlapped it with some field recordings from the places that she's been on the tour. And there's a couple of little bits where she reads the poems. Maybe I'm just a fan, but I really like this album. So give it a listen if you like the kind of thing that I'm describing. I've been listening to it a lot when I've been writing my progress notes at work. I also find it quite inspiring. I like this idea of just making musical sketches and maybe combining them with some sounds. It's the type of thing that, I think more of us could play around with just for our own benefit and maybe put it out into the world for people to hear. To close, I think that this is like another example of Emma Ruth Rundle being quite a fearless and open and creative individual, whose work I really appreciate, and she certainly deserves the audience that she has, and I hope that she continues to be able to live on the work that she's putting out into the world, whether it's visual art, writing, music. So I'd be interested to hear from you about whether you've read this book, or if you might be interested after you hear my description, or if you know her work and you might want to share your experiences with it. If you've seen her live or if you listen to her, jump in the comments, let me know what you think. Otherwise, I will maybe see you again. If I don't see you again, take care.